I used to be rude, judgmental, selfish, ignorant, and unempathetic. It is a strange, sometimes disconcerting experience to open an old chat log or social media conversation from years ago, only to realize how much we have changed. We often do not notice these changes in our daily lives, but seeing the stark difference in our words or attitudes from a bygone era can be jarring. It might involve stumbling upon messages we wrote at 18, 20, or even just 5 years ago, and feeling our stomach twist in embarrassment or shame. The person who once typed those words seems so different from who we are now. I recently had one of those moments. In a fit of nostalgia, or perhaps out of an idle curiosity, I scrolled back through some old conversations on Messenger. For me, that was a trip down memory lane of about 7 to 10 years ago. In many ways, the typical teenage or early 20s swagger was visible, but in reading my own texts, I confronted certain aspects of my past self that I now find deeply uncomfortable. The memories were marked by an almost shockingly unapologetic rudeness, a rigid tendency to judge others, a certain brand of selfishness, ignorance, and a notable absence of empathy. Most humiliatingly, I saw how often I played devil's advocate in conversations, even when my friends were asking for simple support. The impetus for these reflections came when I stumbled upon a particular set of chats from about 8 years ago, back when I was around 20. At the time, I was in college, though the specific stage of my life matters less than the sense of unearned certainty and bluster that filled my words. In these chats, friends were confiding in me about situations in which they felt upset or wronged by someone. The logical or empathetic response, looking at it from today's perspective, would have been to offer sympathy, to try to understand their point of view and to support them view. Instead, my messages read as though I was determined to pick apart their concerns. I'd respond with lines akin to, "But what if the other person didn't realize they were making you feel that way? Maybe it's not as bad as you think," or "Are you sure you aren't being overly sensitive?" Such statements in the right context might come from a place of wanting to remain fair-minded, but rereading them now I sense a callousness, even a dismissiveness. My friends would then politely shift the subject or let the topic die. In many cases, they would not push back, which might have reinforced my habit of playing devil's advocate. These days I realize that by doing so, I often inadvertently invalidated their experiences. Looking back, I have tried to unravel exactly why I was so eager to jump into the role of devil's advocate. The immediate reasons that come to mind revolve around a mixture of adolescent or young adult insecurity and a misguided sense of logic. Perhaps I felt that I had some sort of higher vantage point, or that I was being more objective than my friends. Alternatively, a part of me might have been trying to shield myself from judgments about my own behavior, by normalizing the idea that misunderstandings aren't necessarily the other person's fault. I might have sought to rationalize times I was personally insensitive. There could also have been a streak of self-righteousness. Maybe I thought that defending the absent party or taking a contrarian perspective made me look more intellectual. This is common in younger adults. There is sometimes an urge to stand out by being the one who finds the other angle. While it might be beneficial in certain debates or academic settings, it can come across as uncaring or irritating in close relationships, especially when your friends are simply looking for some emotional support. Those chats also reveal a certain rudeness, not necessarily in direct insults, but in my tone, my readiness to be condescending, and my hidden assumptions about people's motives. I see bits of language that hinted I had a closed mind. "You're probably overreacting, you're not being fair," or "Is that even a big deal?" That me from 8 or so years ago had little interest in actually listening or empathizing. I wanted to make a point or push an angle. My world felt black and white. Someone was either right or wrong, sensitive or strong, rational or emotional, and I placed more value on an impersonal objectivity. In many ways, it was an ignoring of nuance. Empathy, at its core, involves stepping outside one's perspective to understand another's emotional reality. My messages displayed little of that. Instead, I'd respond by focusing on logical alternatives. Maybe the villain in their story was misunderstood, or maybe my friend was just being petty. I suspect that part of my attitude back then was a fear of confrontation or negativity, ironically leading me to deflect or downplay real harm that my friends felt. Another theme resonates in those old chats, a form of selfishness. Back then, my approach to conversation was often, "What can I add or what do I get out of this conversation?" rather than, How can I validate my friend's experience? It was about shaping the narrative so that I seemed calm and rational, potentially at the expense of my friend's feelings. While this might not have been conscious, it certainly emerges from rereading how I approached issues. Instead of thinking, my friend is hurting, how do I help? I might have been thinking, let me show them they might be overreacting, or let me be the voice of reason. That's a self-centered impulse, tied up with my sense of identity at the time. I find it humbling to see how drastically my perspective has changed. These days, if a friend tells me they are upset with how someone treated them, my first instinct is not to poke holes in their argument. Instead, I want to ensure I understand how they feel, offer a supportive ear, and only then, if requested, help them see multiple facets or come up with possible solutions. Some might still term that devil's advocate, but it's more about gently exploring possibilities after acknowledging the emotional dimension, rather than overriding it from the outset. To me, the word cringe is almost an understatement for the jolt of embarrassment I feel. It is a visceral reaction, like a tiny electric shock through my spine, when I see those old messages or remember how I used to handle personal conflicts. The cringe is instructive, though it reveals how far I've come, how I've grown. It's a sign of change. If I felt zero embarrassment, it might imply I hadn't changed my attitudes at all. In conversation with others who have done the same reflection, I find the cringe is universal. Many of us have old diaries, social media posts, or chat logs that betray an older version of ourselves. We see how naive, rude, or ignorant we could be. Yet, it can be healthy to re-experience that discomfort, and it helps us anchor ourselves in the present, mindful of not repeating past mistakes, and encouraging us to continue evolving. One of the deeper concerns that arises from these reflections is the worry that my current friends, especially those who knew me back then, still harbor memories of the old me. The question becomes, do they see me in the context of who I was? Or do they appreciate how much I've changed? Because I'm still close with some of the same people, it's plausible they recall times I was unsupportive or unempathetic. As a result, I might fear that they are more guarded around me, or that they still see me as that person who might wave away their feelings. However, people often give one another more credit than we realize. Many friendships that last are marked by mutual forgiveness, silent acknowledgments of growth, or a recognition that they were younger then. It's also possible that my friends recognized these behaviors for what they were, a stage of immaturity or a period of misguided logic, and chose to remain friends because they saw the potential for better interactions in the future. Indeed, since we've since had great memories, it suggests that we overcame those quirks or adapted to each other's changes. Sometimes, reading old messages spurs a desire to apologize, to say, I'm sorry for dismissing your feelings back then. Some may wonder if it's worth bringing up events from years ago that the other person might have forgotten. But if that person is still dear to us, and we suspect our behavior had a lasting effect, an honest conversation can be healing, especially if done tactfully. It might also yield relief to hear them say, oh, I barely remember that, but thanks. I appreciate your thoughtfulness. At the same time, one must be prepared for the possibility that yes, they do remember, and it may have caused them hurt or distancy. That might open a path to deeper understanding and a reaffirmation that you no longer behave that way. Becoming empathic or respectful of others' feelings is not a trait everyone is born with or fosters early with. For many, it's learned over time through mistakes, consequences, and reflections. The transitional years, late teens and early adulthood, are rife with identity experiments, brash opinions, and a yearning to appear knowledgeable or edgy. Only through repeated social interactions, feedback, or personal reflection do we realize that empathy tends to matter more than being right. Some reflection might show that certain bigger life events triggered the shift. For instance, experiencing heartbreak, dealing with personal failure, or caring for someone going through a tough time might awaken compassion. Or it might simply be the slow accumulation of everyday social feedback. Times you see a friend's face fall when you dismiss their pain, or noticing how supportive people respond better to conflicts. Over time, you absorb that positivity resonates more than condescension. The period in my life that corresponds with these rude, unempathetic behaviors was also a time I felt insecure about my own place in the world. Perhaps I was anxious about how people perceived me, so I deflected by criticizing or questioning them. Perhaps I was worried about being intellectually respected, leading me to adopt the devil's advocate stance. Maybe I was also subconsciously justifying my own moral lapses by insisting others do the same. Recognizing that these issues often stem from internal anxieties helps me treat that younger self with some kindness. I needed acceptance, clarity, or direction, and I tried to get it in misguided ways. There's a delicate balance between acknowledging the cringe factor of old behaviors and not condemning ourselves to perpetual guilt. Growth is the natural arc of life. The fact that I feel remorse or shame now implies that I wouldn't replicate those behaviors in the present. That in itself is evidence of progress. While it's beneficial to remember the lessons, it's also important to maintain self-compassion. If I had not made those mistakes or had those misguided stances, I might not have learned the empathy I carry today. Engage with the embarrassment. Instead of shoving aside the memories, face them. Read them carefully. Think about the context. Accept that you've changed and see what triggers the biggest shame. Pinpoint growth. Identify exactly how you would react differently now. That is a sign of growth. Notice specific shifts like, I used to scold a friend for venting, but now I'd express solidarity first. Consider apologies. If the old conversation or behavior might have caused genuine harm, consider a gentle apology, especially if you're still close with that person. A direct mention can sometimes release lingering tensions. Cultivate empathy. Realize that everyone, at some time, has had behaviors they regret. This can drive you to empathize with others whose past you see as flawed. We're all flawed in progress. Be aware of your insecurities. Understand that your rude or ignorant stances might have come from personal insecurities. A knowledge of that can help you maintain vigilance not to let those insecurities resurface in negativity. Celebrate the distance. The cringe means you are no longer that person. This is something to appreciate. If you never changed, you might not cringe at all, but that would also mean missing out on growth, though. If I read my current texts or reflect on my present approach to friends' problems, I find I am far more likely to say, "That sounds really tough," or "How can I help?" This shift wasn't an overnight epiphany. It developed through repeated lessons, through being on the receiving end of similar dismissals, and gradually recognizing the importance of shared emotional understanding. These days, I still love logical discussions, but I try not to start from a place that invalidates someone's experience. Instead, I might offer alternative views only after acknowledging their feelings. This is not to say I've reached some perfect state. Growth is continuous. I might still occasionally slip into an overly logical mode, especially if I'm stressed or not mindful. But the stark difference from my 20-year-old self is that I am aware. I can catch myself and pivot, or apologize if I realize I'm repeating old patterns. The cringe from reading those old chats acts as a cautionary memory, reminding me to be kinder and more empathetic in the future. Ultimately, being unapologetically rude, judgmental, and unempathetic at a younger age doesn't define who we remain forever. Many of us have phases marked by ignorance or thoughtlessness. What matters is the capacity to learn, to see how our words can hurt or hinder connection, and to proactively adopt empathy as a default stance. The awkward truths from our past can be the stepping stones to maturity. I sometimes wonder if, in another 10 years, I'll look back on the current version of myself and cringe anew. Probably. That's part of the human condition. We keep refining. And that's a comforting thought. We are allowed to keep growing. If my younger self could see me now, they might be startled by how often I shut up and listen rather than rushing to fix or critique. They might see that some of their heated debates actually cost them closeness with people who needed emotional presence, not intellectual sparring. But hopefully that younger me would also be proud that I took the time to learn and to care better. And that is the real heart of these reflective journeys. Discovering that the past is not an iron chain to weigh us down, but a context that underscores why the present, us, tries to do better. Revisiting cringeworthy old social media conversations can provoke shame, but it can also illuminate personal growth. Recognizing the difference between a younger self who might have been rude or unempathetic and today's more considerate self is a testament to progress. While it's natural to worry if old friends still see us as that bad version, time and consistent demonstration of growth typically shift their perceptions too. In the end, the cringe is not an indictment but a sign of evolution, a reminder that we can indeed change for the better, and that empathy is something we learn, practice, and refine throughout our lives.